In the repo, I have documented each step of how I built the API from scratch and each step of how I set the API up for automated testing in enumerated branches. You'll also find additional information for each step in the READMEs folder of the repo. Now that we have the ADD folks taken care of, let the detailed walkthrough begin. In this video, I am going to show you how to test in an automated manner your APIs using Postman. The reason why I like using Postman is threefold. 1, it's easy to use. 2, it's low code. And 3, it decouples your code from your API framework. The technique of using Postman to test your APIs will apply to every web app framework that supports HTTP. Ruby on Rails, Express, Laravel, Spring, Django. It'll apply to all of them. In part 1, we will build an API with authentication from scratch using a web application framework called Fastify. And I will show you in roughly 2 minutes, aka 1000x speed, what was built so you have a firm understanding of the code we will be testing. In part 2, we will test our API using Postman. We will build and run our tests using the graphical user interface that Postman provides, and we will also run our tests using the Postman CLI, which is called Newman. The bonus part at the end will consist of us performance testing our API to verify and audit some of the claims made on the Fastify website. Let's build this API from scratch. We are starting with a folder with a README in it. We add a .gitignore. We make this a node project by adding a package.json file. We add a READMEs folder for housing information about each step of this process. We install packages for the first time. That's why we see a package-lock.json file now. We are installing TypeScript packages. We will be installing many more packages as this proceeds. We configure the TypeScript compiler via the tsconfig.json file. We add a source folder for housing all of the application code. We add a .vs code folder. Right now it has a settings.json file in it. This is how we set up Prettier to auto-format our code. We add a nodemon.json file. This is how we set up our project to be compatible with nodemon and the VS Code debugger. We add a launch.json file. This is also for setting up our project to work with the VS Code debugger. We add all of the code for our authentication API. We next add a __tests__ folder. This is where all of the Jest tests will sit. We will not focus on Jest in this video, but Jest is cool too. It depends on what you're trying to do. Jest might be more appropriate, but I think for most people, Postman is going to be more intuitive and easier to pick up, which is why I have focused on it. We next add a DB module. This is where the DB connector will sit for storing data into MongoDB. The next step, it doesn't look like anything happened, but if we go into the package.json file, we see that we have installed Fastify cookie and Fastify JWT. These will power the authentication logic. We next add ESLint. This is a code linter or code cleaner. This will remove unused variables, remove unused imports, etc. We next add support for .env files. We then add the emails module. We will need to send emails for our authentication API, for example, verification emails or password reset emails. I am using Amazon SES for this. Next, we do some refactoring. Then we add the Postman folder. Inside of here, we will put the tests that we will build with the Postman GUI in the following section, or the following part 2. Next, we add some utility scripts for being able to run our Postman tests either in parallel or in sequence. And finally, in step 20, we add some documentation for how to do performance or benchmark testing. So hopefully that gives you a good feel of what you're looking at and what the code does and is. Now let's test this using Postman. So you can come over to postman.com and download the Postman GUI for your operating system of choice. And when you have that installed, you should see something like this when you launch the application. So over here is where you can specify different API calls you want to make against your API. And you'll get the responses back over here, and you can configure each API call over here. So let me show you what that looks like. Let's say I want to hit the health check endpoint on my API. First, I will need to run my API. And now that it's listening, I can call the health check endpoint. And with Postman, I can write tests inside of this section to validate the responses I get back. So you can see the logs are responding to each request that I send. Here I'm walking through an authentication flow. Right? Hopefully it's very intuitive. You can see I am signing up, signing in, checking if I am authenticated, verifying my account, resetting my password, signing out, deleting my account, blah, 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 right? And I am validating that the responses I get back from the API are as expected. So I can run all of these running the collection. You see, now they all passed, right? So this is an easy way to do integration tests or flows against your entire API. And you can export your collections like so. You can export the collection by clicking this button, and you will get a JSON file that looks something like this: authflow mock password reset.postman collection.json. That is what we are seeing here. So this is a JSON that does exactly the same thing that we are doing here. And we can install a tool called Newman to run these collections and tests from the command line, like this. So you also have to export your environment variables. You can template out environment variables like this in Postman and specify your global or environment variables in this section over here. But yeah, so you export your collection along with the environment variables that you want to use, and you can run the collection programmatically with Newman, like so, right? And you get the test results summary right here. So you can use this for CI/CD, etc., etc., etc. Here we are on Fastify's website, And if we come over here to this section where it says benchmarks, we see that it claims Fastify can serve about 5 times the requests per second than Express.js can. So let's verify if this is actually true. Here is the code. Express.js, and the API has the same interface or shape that the Fastify API does. So if I come here and run the Fastify API and run our Postman collection or integration test against it, we see that everything passes. I can run the Express.js API here and run the same tests again to reuse the tests. Supposedly, this is our request per second. So if we divide that by 5, we get maybe 700 something or so. I do rough math in my head. So let's run the same benchmark or load test, this time against the Express API that has the same interface as the Fastify API. Not a fifth of the requests as was claimed on the Fastify website. Maybe my tools are flawed, but I guess the point I am trying to make is always verify and audit all of the information that you are intaking.